Good afternoon and welcome to the 10th Annual Sacred Trust History Talks and Book Signing event hosted by Gettysburg National Military Park and the Gettysburg Foundation. My name is Dan Welch and I'm the Education Programs Coordinator with the Gettysburg Foundation. The Gettysburg Foundation is the nonprofit partner of the National Park Service here at Gettysburg. And over the years, as we've presented Sacred Trust, we have had the pleasure of hosting renowned Civil War historians and authors, National Park Service rangers, and licensed battlefield guides, so they can share their unique perspectives on the Battle of Gettysburg with you, our visitors and guests. Coming up next, we have Mr. Kevin Levin, and he will be presenting a talk entitled Remembering the Battle of the Crater. This battle is best remembered for the detonation of 8,000 pounds of explosives on the morning of July 30th, 1864. It is also, however, the first time in the Eastern Theater of War that an entire division of United States colored troops were employed on the battlefield. Mr. Levin will discuss the performance of black soldiers during the war and their contribution to the Union victory. Kevin Levin is the author of several books, articles, and essays, is a teacher of history at Gann Academy near Boston, and over the past 15 years he has taught a wide range of courses, including the Civil War, race and gender, and women's history. He has continued to pursue outreach endeavors aimed at history teachers through Teaching American History and the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. Please welcome Mr. Kevin M. Levin.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming out today. I just want to thank, before I get started, I just want to thank the Gettysburg Foundation and the National Park Service for including me in this event. It's just a great lineup, and it's just a huge honor for me to be a part of this. And the weather couldn't be better, so it's always nice to be at Gettysburg, but especially when the weather's nice. So last year, I think it's safe to say that much of the nation's attention was focused here on Gettysburg for the 150th anniversary of the battle. A year later, it's still nice to see some crowds sort of mulling about here at the Visitor Center as well as on the battlefield. But I think it's safe to say that the 150th anniversary of the war in 1864, I think it's safe to say that interest has probably declined in the last year since last summer. And it's probably no surprise why. The war in 1864, many of the battles are very difficult to get your head around. Some of the battlefields themselves are inaccessible to visitors, but they don't admit of the sort of dramatic flanking marches that are so popular in the early years of the war. There's no Stonewall Jackson. The war seems bloodier. It's just more difficult to get your head around them. But I think the other thing that is at issue here when it comes to remembering 1864 is that the war itself has taken what you might say is a hard turn. The war has become much bloodier here in Virginia in the east, as well as in other places. Think of Sherman's March, the kind of destruction wrought by Sherman and his men in late 1864. But the other issue I think that makes it difficult to really sort of understand and come to terms with is the issue of race. I think that's one issue that Americans still today still have trouble dealing with when it comes to the American Civil War. We want to remember the soldiers, we want to remember what they did on the battlefield, but when it comes to some of the messier questions, some of the tougher questions, I think sometimes we fall short. And so in my talk today, I want to talk about a different kind of human interest story from the kinds of stories that Bud Robertson just talked so eloquently about. I'm going to talk about the Battle of the Crater, and as was just mentioned, this is going to be the first time that the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's army, faces off against a large number of black soldiers. And I want to talk about what happened to those black soldiers. This is one of the largest massacres of black Union soldiers during the war. And I want to talk about why many of them were massacred and what Confederates had to say about that massacre, both during the war and a little bit after the war. So I want to sort of say up front, I'm not going to censor any of the language contained in the letters today. And I think that's something that is part of this story that we have to deal with. So here we go. The prisoners were formed in line 4 abreast, with senior officers in the lead, followed by 4 black soldiers. 4 more white soldiers followed, and so on. Once in formation, the racially mixed column was ordered to parade through the streets of Petersburg, Virginia, in full view of the town's remaining civilian population. The roughly 1,500 black and white Union prisoners who had been captured following their failed assault just east of the city the previous day in what would come to be called the Battle of the Crater were to be used to send a strong message to the men serving in Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, the white residents of Petersburg, as well as the rest of the Confederacy. As the prisoners marched and countermarched through the streets, they were subjected to taunts and abuses. Quote, "See the white and nigger equality soldiers, and Yanks and niggers sleep in the same bed," could be heard from angry women on the street level and verandas, which offered perhaps the best view of this spectacle. The march through the city was the first stage in a longer journey to prison camps further south, and for a few unlucky ones, a return to bondage. This unusual scene, along with the well-documented accounts of the massacre of large numbers of United States colored troops, has unfortunately received only passing attention by the few historians who have written about this battle. The lack of attention reflects the continued challenge of dealing with the divisive issue of race in our collective memory of the Civil War. While historians have in recent years worked to better understand how the presence of USCTs at the crater and elsewhere changed the course of the war, popular perceptions lag behind. Rather, the battle, including the early morning detonation of 8,000 pounds of explosives under a Confederate salient, as well as the close quarter fighting that ensued, continues to be understood as one of the clearest examples of the hard turn of war that defined much of the fighting in Virginia, beginning with Union General U.S. Grant's Overland Campaign in May 1864. The presence of USCTs on the crater battlefield signaled a dramatic shift in the goals and policies of the Lincoln administration. By the summer of 1862, President Abraham Lincoln turned to a limited plan of emancipation and recruitment of black soldiers as a means to saving the Union. Despite the deeply ingrained racism that pervaded Union ranks and Northern society, tens of thousands of free and formerly enslaved blacks embraced the opportunity to enlist and fight for their freedom, as well as family members still held in bondage. Military service offered black men the opportunity to prove their manhood and the possibility of securing political and civil rights in a reconstructed Union. In sharp contrast, the presence of an entire division of armed black men in blue uniforms on a battlefield situated outside of a large civilian population at Petersburg meant something very different to the men in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. For white Southerners in the Army and on the home front, this dramatic shift in the racial profile of the Union Army reinforced fears of social and political equality with blacks, along with the blood-soaked images of race wars, miscegenation, and the defilement of white women. White Southerners harbored these fears throughout the antebellum period in response to slave rebellions in the Caribbean, as well as the constant threat, both real and imagined, in the American South. The large-scale massacre of USCTs is best understood as a result of long-standing fears of slave insurrections and as a defense of a social, political, and economic hierarchy based on white supremacy. In short, the actions of Confederate soldiers at the crater, slave and non-slave owning alike, suggest that they viewed the battle as nothing less than a slave rebellion. The basic outline of the battle is familiar to most Civil War enthusiasts. In an attempt to break what was beginning to take on a characteristic of a siege, the Army of the Potomac exploded 8,000 pounds of explosives under a Confederate salient in the early morning hours of July 30, 1864, just east of Petersburg, Virginia. Following the massive detonation, General Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps, which included a division of USCTs under the command of Brigadier General Edward Ferrero, advanced toward the salient with the goal of taking the heights around Blandford Cemetery, which overlooked the city. From the beginning, nothing went right for Burnside's 4 divisions. the sight of a smoldering crater measuring 125 feet long, 50 feet wide, and 30 feet deep cost them precious time as the men gazed at the destruction wrought by the mine and worked to uncover members of Brigadier General Stephen Elliott's South Carolina Brigade, who were positioned directly above it. By 7 a.m., 3 Union white divisions were crammed tightly within the confines of the crater itself, or were bogged down in the complex chain of traverses and bomb-proofs that extended outward. A number of attempts were made to push forward beyond the crater, and a few scattered units managed to secure some ground. But Confederate forces, including well-positioned artillery, quickly responded to prevent a breakout. By the time Burnside ordered his colored 4th Division into battle around 8 a.m., it had become apparent to many that the day had been lost. Nevertheless, a few scattered regiments in Ferrer's division managed to move through the crater and into advanced positions along with scattered elements of the rest of the corps in preparation for one final advance toward their objective. Any opportunity for a concerted push was quickly lost as Confederate General William Mahone arrived around 9 a.m. with his division and ordered the 800 Virginians from Brigadier General David Weisiger's brigade into battle. 2 additional brigades from Mahone's division were eventually ordered into the mix before fighting died down in the early afternoon and the salient was retaken. Union casualties numbered roughly 3,800, with all but 300 confined to Burnside's 9th Corps. Ferrero's division accounted for more than 1/3 of all Union casualties. Confederate casualties numbered approximately 1,400. While the scale of violence witnessed at the crater fit into the broader narrative of a war that had surpassed what many believed possible in 1861, the presence of USCTs constituted a fundamental shift in the conflict for the men in the Army of Northern Virginia. In the days and weeks following the battle, Confederates attempted to make sense of the significance of this shift in their letters and diaries, and in doing so, achieved a remarkable level of consensus. That consensus was achieved by slave and non-slave holders alike and points to the shared responsibilities that all white Southerners shared or assumed throughout the first half of the 19th century in securing their communities from the threat of slave rebellions, again, both real and imagined. While Nat Turner's deadly insurrection in Southampton County, Virginia, in August 1831, that took the lives of over 60 men, women, and children loomed large, white Southerners also remembered failed attempts in Richmond, led by Gabriel Prosser in 1801, and in South Carolina by Denmark Vesey in 1823. They also closely followed the news from the West Indies, which was an area that experienced continuous violence in places like Haiti, 1791, Barbados in 1816, and Demerara in 1823. In the case of Nat Turner's actions, white Southerners were quick to point out that only outside agitators could upset the peacefulness and paternalism that they believed bound slaves and whites to one another. That the rebellion followed closely on the heels of the publication of William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator in January of 1831, and the formation of an organized abolitionist movement in the North provided an easy scapegoat. The sectional disputes of the 1840s and 50s offered a continual reminder of the dangers posed by outside agitators and a hostile federal government. Slave patrols and state laws meant to delineate racial boundaries and exercise tighter control of the region's black population bound white Southerners ever more closely. John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry in October of 1859 and the election of the nation's first black Republican as president convinced many in the slaveholding South of the necessity of secession as the only solution to the protection of slavery and their continued security. The men who defended Petersburg and its civilian population on that hot July day not only understood the nature of the threat posed by black soldiers, more importantly, they understood what needed to be done in response. They were also aware of their own government's policy, which stated that black soldiers and their white officers were to be treated as criminals, liable to enslavement and or summary execution. William Mahone's Virginia Brigade may have understood the danger that armed blacks represented even more than other units who participated in the battle. The 5 regiments that comprised the Virginia Brigade all hailed from areas in the immediate vicinity, including Petersburg, Richmond, Norfolk, Suffolk, and Portsmouth. Both the Petersburg Greys and Petersburg City Guard, both of which joined the 12th Virginia, were part of the security detail in Charlestown, Virginia, at the hanging of John Brown in December of 1859. Mahone himself was born and raised in Southampton County, where Turner's Rebellion took place, roughly 40 miles from Petersburg. Many of the men in these units understood the fragile nature of slavery in Eastern Virginia and would have remembered the horror of Turner's Rebellion firsthand, or would have heard stories passed down as part of their assimilation in a slave-based society. Lee's men were already engaged in heated combat by the time Ferrero's Black Division entered the battle. For the survivors of Elliott's South Carolina Brigade, as well as the other units in the immediate vicinity of the crater, the first indication of the presence of black soldiers on the battlefield was their battle cry of "Remember Fort Pillow," a reference to the massacre of black soldiers at Fort Pillow, Tennessee, a few months earlier. Many Confederate accounts include a reference to Fort Pillow, though it is impossible to know how many actually heard such a battle cry given the noise and confusion of the battlefield. The sight of these men alone would have been sufficient to change the very nature of the reaction of Lee's men. It had the same effect upon our men that a red flag had upon a mad bull, was the way one South Carolinian who survived the initial explosion described the reaction to his comrades. David Holt of the 16th Mississippi remembered, quote, they were the first we had seen, and the sight of a nigger in a blue uniform and with a gun was more than Johnny Reb could stand. Fury had taken possession of Holt, and I knew that I felt as ugly as they looked. The harsh language used to describe black soldiers not only worked to dehumanize these individuals, it also made possible swift retaliation that went beyond the accepted rules of warfare. Many Confederates relished the opportunity to share with loved ones back home of their experiences at the crater fighting Ferrero's division, and they did so in a way which bordered on the cathartic. Such detail allowed those on the home front to experience this new danger at a comfortable distance. Our men killed them with the bayonets and the butts of their guns and every other way until they were lying 8 or 10 deep on top of one another, and the blood almost shoe-quarter deep, wrote Labnum Odom, who served in the 48th Georgia. Another soldier in the same regiment described the hand-to-hand combat, quote, the bayonet was plunged through their hearts, and the muzzle of our guns was put on their temple, and their brains blown out. Others were knocked in the head with the butts of our guns. Few would succeed in getting to the rear safe. The communication of these violent encounters reinforced the connections between battlefield and home front. The fact that the battle occurred while defending a large civilian population also made it easier for family members and others more removed from the scene of fighting to imagine the consequences of a Union victory that now included black soldiers. The presence of USCTs also served as a rallying cry for Confederates who did not participate in the battle. Writing about the battle served as an outlet through which they could express their own resentment and anger over the use of black soldiers, describing how, quote, our men bayoneted them and knocked their brains in with the butt of their guns, as did one soldier, may have been the next best thing to being there. A.T. Fleming, who served in the 10th Alabama but missed the battle due to illness, could not help but allow his racist preconceptions to pervade a very descriptive account in which Confederates, quote, knocked them in the head like killing hogs. For the soldiers who did not take part in the fight at the crater, the sharing of stories bound them more closely with those who did and served to remind family members that they were actively engaged in their defense from the threat of armed former slaves. Once the salient was retaken, Confederate rage was difficult to bring under control. Confederates wrote freely about taking part in the execution of surrendered black soldiers and in admitting their own involvement in these incidents. They do not hide anything from their loved ones and the general public. Jerome Yates of the 16th Mississippi recalled, quote, "Most of the Negroes were killed after the battle. Some was killed after they were taken to the rear." According to Henry Byrd of the 12th Virginia, quote, "The only sounds which now broke the silence was some poor, wounded wretch begging for water and quieted by a bayonet thrust which said unmistakably, 'Drink your blood, you will have no more thirst.'" The scale of the violence accorded to black soldiers mirrored the swift response against slave rebellions throughout the antebellum period and suggests that the actions taken at the crater ought not to be understood simply as the result of collective rage, but one that they would have understood as a measured response meant to achieve specific ends. The exact number is difficult to nail down, but it is not a stretch to suggest that anywhere between 200 and 300 United States colored troops were executed. Analyzing the Confederate response at the crater, alongside slave rebellions extending back to the beginning of the 19th century, opens up the possibility of a more nuanced explanation. An 1816 rebellion on the island of Barbados resulted in the execution of roughly 200 slaves, and in Demerara, a few years later, another 200 slaves were executed following a failed rebellion. In addition, roughly 200 slaves were either publicly tortured or executed following Turner's Rebellion in 1831. Such violent responses served a number of purposes. Most notably, it sent a strong message to the slave community of who was in control and that such actions had no hope of succeeding. A direct and brutal response also worked to drain any remaining enthusiasm for rebellion. If we apply this framework to the crater, we can move beyond the heightened emotional response contained in soldiers' letters and better discern the intended consequences of the scale of violence meted out to black soldiers outside of Petersburg. Once again, it is important to acknowledge that the men in the Army of Northern Virginia were responsible for the defense of a civilian population and any remaining slaves in the area. The scale of executions at the crater served as a strong message to the region's black population that any attempt at following in the footsteps of these soldiers would be dealt with in the harshest of terms. Not surprisingly, as a result of their experience fighting black soldiers, many Confederates experienced a renewed sense of purpose and commitment to the cause. Years after the war, Edward Porter Alexander remembered that the, quote, general feeling of the men towards their employment, the employment of black men as soldiers, was very bitter. The sympathy of the North for John Brown's memory was taken for proof of a desire that our slaves should rise in a servile insurrection and massacre throughout the South, and the enlistment of Negro troops was regarded as advertisement of that desire and encouragement of the idea to the Negro. William Pegram also acknowledged the perceived threat as stated by Alexander when he noted that, quote, "I had been hoping that the enemy would bring some Negroes against this army, and now that they had, I am convinced that it has a splendid effect on our men." Pegram concluded that though it seems cruel to murder them in cold blood, the men who did it had a very good cause for doing so. The experience of fighting black soldiers for the first time served to remind Lee's men of exactly what was at stake in the war, nothing less than an overturning of the racial hierarchy of their antebellum world. Newspapers published in the days following the battle echoed the enthusiasm of the men in Lee's army. Editors used the occasion to remind their readers of the sacrifices being made in the trenches of Petersburg and went to great lengths to encourage their readers to remain optimistic and supportive of military efforts in hopes that further victories may lead to a Lincoln defeat in the November presidential election. Inevitably, newspaper accounts of the battle referenced the presence of USCTs, and they did so in a way that reinforced themes already present in the letters and diaries of the soldiers. Most accounts included the widely reported screams of "no quarter" and were used to justify the response of Confederate soldiers both on the battlefield and in the immediate aftermath. An editorial in a Petersburg newspaper noted the war cry, but followed up by noting that, quote, "Our brave boys took them at their word and gave them what they had so loudly called for, no quarter." The Richmond Dispatch included a great deal of commentary that referenced the presence of black soldiers in the battle to both warn its readers of possible dangers and as a means to maintain support for the war effort. By including such detail, readers on the home front were made aware of the dangers that black soldiers represented, and by extension, the dangers posed by their own slaves. Quote, "Negroes stimulated by whiskey may possibly fight well so long as they fight successfully," continued the report, "but the first good whipping, their courage, like that of Bob Acres, a popular fictional character, oozes out at their fingers," ends. The attempt to deny black manhood by assuming they were stimulated by whiskey to fight reinforced stereotypes, while the reference to whipping took on a dual meaning between the battlefield and the home front as a way to maintain racial control. The Richmond Examiner, I'll give you one additional newspaper comment, a wonderful comment from the Richmond Examiner. The Examiner not only acknowledged the execution of black Union soldiers, but went a step further and encouraged Mahone to continue the practice in the further. And here's what the editorial says: "We beg him," meaning Mahone, "hereafter, when Negroes are sent forward to murder the wounded and come shouting no quarter, shut your eyes, General, strengthen your stomach with a little brandy and water, and let the work which God has entrusted to you and your brave men go forward to its full completion. That is, until every Negro has been slaughtered. Make every salient you are called upon to defend of Fort Pillow. Butcher every Negro that Grant sends against your brave troops, and permit them not to soil their hands with the capture of a single hero." Newspapers portrayed these men as the only obstacle preventing the slaughter of innocent civilians at the hands of uncontrollable former slaves who had been duped into fighting their former masters. The editorial acknowledged the emotional difficulty attached to such behavior, which under normal circumstances would demand the paternal instincts that white Southerners claimed to exercise in the management of their slaves. In the wake of the crater, however, it was necessary for Lee and his men to stand firm in preventing Nat Turner writ large. And this brings us full circle back to the parade of black and white Union prisoners through the streets of Petersburg. First and foremost, the parade, ordered by A.P. Hill, represented control and submissiveness to the residents who lined the streets and verandas in holiday attire. Most importantly, the Army demonstrated its ability to continue to defend the residents of the city from the Union Army, as well as captured black soldiers. While the racial mixing of Union prisoners served to humiliate white soldiers, it also functioned as a reminder to the residents of Petersburg and the rest of the Confederacy of just what was at stake now that black soldiers had been introduced to the battlefield. The parade was a controlled example of race mixing, and it was acknowledged as such by local residents. But the taunts and screams from the residents indicates that they understood that their worst fears would come true in the event that their army were defeated. On November 6, 1903, the streets of Petersburg were filled with Confederate veterans and white Virginians from across the state to reenact the Battle of the Crater. This is one of two large-scale reenactments of the crater that takes place after the war. The other one was in 1937. The sham battle impressed a young boy by the name of Douglas Southall Freeman, who pledged to his father at the end of the day that he was going to write the story of these men. The reenactment was an opportunity for the Civil War generation to pass on stories of their lost cause to a new generation of Virginians. William Stewart, who served as colonel of the 61st Virginia, used the occasion to canvass the men under his command for their memories of the battle, possibly for some type of publication, but that never came to fruition. Though the accounts are relatively brief, they demonstrate clearly that the aging veterans had little difficulty recalling the horror of battle, the details of close combat, and the number of the enemy they individually killed. Many of the contributors no doubt took part in the reenactment, and this may have made it easier to recall the more visceral emotions that went along with fighting at the crater, emotions that had been suppressed with time. William Pate, who served in Company D of the 61st Virginia, clearly recalled the cry of "No quarter, remember Fort Pillow," and also remembered that, quote, "I killed 3 Negroes with the bayonet." William Emerson also remembered, quote, "shooting a Negro as he ran over the hill, trying to escape." Another soldier could not recall how many of the enemy he killed, quote, "and I don't want to know, but I did my best." And John T. West of Company A recalled the Confederates were, quote, "greatly exasperated after hearing that blacks were taking part in the battle. I saw one Negro soldier wounded, and he was trying to get up off his knees," remembered a soldier in Company I, when Laban Godwin hit him in the face with the breech of his gun. "I told him to stop, that as the Negro was dying." Veterans from outside the Old Dominion also continued to recall with apparent ease the horrors of the crater, and even after 40 years, their shock at having to fight black soldiers. W.A. Day, who served in the 49th North Carolina, shared in very graphic detail the slaughter of the crater. Quote, "The soldiers were excited. They were reckless. They burst the Negroes' skulls with the butts of their guns like eggshells. The officers tried to prevent it," continued Day, "but they were powerless." A veteran from the 11th Alabama Regiment described, quote, "an odor equaled only by a skunk," as he engaged a black soldier in a brawl within the crater. The scuffle ended only after a comrade gave the Negro a blow on the top of his head that killed him. The emotionally charged memories of the veterans of the crater, former slave owners and non-slave owners alike, clearly reflect a lingering bitterness at having to fight black soldiers during the war. The individual memories of Confederate veterans contrasted sharply with an evolving public memory that largely steered clear of overt references to African Americans. The strong emotions attached to memories of black soldiers were indelibly stamped on the minds of Confederate veterans and likely informed their own understanding of a region that had once again established legal white supremacy, laws that came to define the Jim Crow era. Their inability or unwillingness to ignore or downplay these memories suggests that their own understanding of the significance of this particular battle and the war remain closely tied to having to fight black men. Thanks for listening. Al Mackey.
Hey.
Go for it, Al.
Kevin, given William Mahone's post-war political career as the head of the readjusters, what was his specific personal role in the massacre? Did he take part? Did he order any killings during that time?
Yeah, so can all of you hear me through the mic? So the question is about Brigadier General Mahone, who was in command of the division, the Confederate division, that is responsible for the famous counterattack that is in part responsible for saving the day for the Army of Northern Virginia outside of Petersburg at the crater. Mahone is on the battlefield. There's no evidence to suggest that he didn't know about the massacre of black soldiers. There's no order from Mahone. There's no order from any other high-ranking Confederate general either ordering the massacre or trying to prevent it. This is something I think that happens, spontaneously on the part of Lee's men. I think it's, as I said earlier in the paper, they know how to respond to the presence of black men with weapons. Now, Mahone is a fascinating character, and as I was writing my book on Mahone, by far he is the most interesting part of the story, because as Al just mentioned, Mahone after the war becomes the leader of the most successful third-party political party in Virginia in the 1880s called the Readjuster Party. And the Readjuster Party I'll make a long story short, is successful because Mahone, a former Confederate general, attracts a large number of Virginia's black population. This is an interracial political party. They control the governor, the governor's chair, the state legislature for 4 years. They control Virginia state politics. So the largest number of black children are going to school in the 1880s in Virginia. The largest number of black teachers are teaching in the 1880s. And it's not because of the evil Yankees coming down south and imposing Reconstruction. It's happening from within, from a former Confederate general. And Mahone, as a result of this, is blasted in the press. You can imagine the controversy that ensues as a result of Mahone's foray into Virginia politics. And if you can think back a few years ago to the difficulty that John Kerry had in trying to marshal his political record for his political push for the White House, Mahone ends up with the same problem. Members of his former command go against him because of his politics, and of course many Virginians are very troubled by Mahone's post-war politics. So he is long forgotten, in part because of what he did in Virginia after the war. But William Mahone, in my mind, is one of the most fascinating 19th century Virginians that you don't know much about beyond the war. Absolutely fascinating and central to Virginia's post-war politics. Absolutely central.
Is this on? Okay. I have two general questions about the USCT. One, if you can comment about the fact that black soldiers were paid half, a policy which I believe was endorsed by Lincoln, and even though Frederick Douglass asked him to change it, he wouldn't. And also comment on Thaddeus Stevens' role in changing that policy so that they get full pay. And also, I have a very general question about current politics, where you have people as diverse as Ron Maxwell and Ron Paul claiming that the South would have gotten rid of slavery if those pesky abolitionists just hadn't been so obnoxious.
I'll deal with the second one first without dealing with current politics, because your question can be dealt with as a question pertaining to history and what we know about the history. The idea that slavery is on its way out by the end of the 1850s is complete myth. That is just simply wrong. And we need to stop making those claims. The value of slaves, this is a point that David Blight makes whenever he's on television, and he's right about this. The value of slaves on the eve of the Civil War, total it up, is worth more than all the material goods in the North. The value of slaves, the role of slavery, has never been more important to the South's overall economy. What slaves are doing by the end of the antebellum period is varied. They're working in factories in Richmond, warehouses in Petersburg. So the image of slaves as simply being tied to large plantations, we need to sort of begin to move away from that. Of course, most are doing that kind of work. But the South they think of themselves as modern, as part of a burgeoning capitalistic system tied to the rest of the world. It is an expanding economy. So the value of slaves is at an all-time high. In fact, in some parts of the Confederacy during the war itself, it continues to go up. So we need to move away from that. And so we don't need to deal with modern politics to make that claim. That's just being a good historian. Now, the other question was about USCTs. I don't know too much about Thaddeus Stevens' specific role in all of this. It is true that black soldiers are paid less than white soldiers. And this comes out if you've seen the movie Glory. There's a scene in that story about the 54th Massachusetts where they tear up their pay slips. The movie gets the spirit right, the timing all wrong. But black soldiers do protest. This is something we sort of have ignored or downplayed. Black soldiers are protesting from roughly, I think, the spring of '63 through the summer of '64 for equal pay. So on the one hand, we think of them as sort of fighting against the Confederacy, trying to help save the Union. At the same time, they are protesting in varied ways against their own government for equal pay. And eventually, in the summer of '64, Congress does authorize it. I don't believe that Lincoln is responsible directly for the pay issue. I think it's Congress.
But couldn't he have made an executive order to equalize?
Perhaps. Executive orders, I'm sure, can be used for any number of things, but it's Congress that takes care of it. So, so good questions. Thank you. Others, please.
Thank you. Was there any attempt after the war by the Union to prosecute any of the Confederates involved in the massacre, or any attempt even to bring some sort of justice?
No. No, it's a quick no. After the war, I'll just say a couple things about sort of what happens to the battlefield. The battlefield in Petersburg, if you've been there, it's not the most impressive place. If you were there in 1864, a massive sized crater, the result of that huge explosion. In the 1920s, the battlefield itself was in the hands of a private family up until the early 20th century, the Griffith family. And then for a brief period in the 1920s, it was turned into an 18-hole golf course. And you can see the outlines of the golf course if you go there today. It's smooth ground. You don't get a sense of the traverses and bomb-proofs that would have littered that battlefield, that landscape in 1864. But it was an 18-hole golf course. For a brief period of time, I spent some time with the company's records in Petersburg. They don't pay any of their bills, and so it's easy to see what happens to this company within a few short years. And by the early 1930s, the National Park Service begins to work to gain control of it, and in 1936-37, it becomes part of the Park Service. But that landscape in Petersburg is pretty much controlled by Mahone and his Virginia veterans. Like I said, many of the men under Mahone's command in the Virginia Brigade are raised in that area. And so the Virginians hold their reunions on the battlefield. They meet with some of the Union veterans throughout the 1880s and 1890s on the battlefield. But it's Virginians who exercise a great deal of control over how that battle is remembered. And if you know anything about the battle is remembered as Mahone's charge. In the same way that you could say that here at Gettysburg, it's the Virginians after the war who go to great length to make sure that it's Pickett's charge that's remembered as the high water mark or the most important part of the battlefield. And other Confederate veterans from other states here at Gettysburg and at the crater, they go at it with those Virginians because the Virginians don't remember them in their accounts. They downplay their importance. It was Mahone and his Virginians who were responsible for everything that happened at the crater. So we forget about the Alabamians and the South Carolinians and everyone else. So the post-war bickering is another part of this story that's truly fascinating that I absolutely loved exploring in the book. I think there were a couple other questions, or please.
Yes. Yes, what was the reaction in the northern newspapers?
Yeah. So in this paper, I didn't talk much about Northern soldiers. If you read Northern soldiers' accounts, many of them do eventually, after they blame Burnside, after they blame some of the brigade commanders, they point the blame for their defeat at the hands of the black soldiers. And that pretty much pervades many of the Union accounts. There are also accounts of Union soldiers bayoneting, and even a couple accounts of soldiers shooting their fellow black soldiers. Not as many. It's very difficult to analyze for a couple of reasons, but I'll make a long story short by saying, as I mentioned in my talk, some of those black units managed to get the furthest in their goal of gaining the heights overlooking Petersburg. So it's a mixed group of black and white soldiers that make the farthest advance. Once Mahone's counterattack takes place, that advanced group of soldiers begins to push back on a rear line of Union soldiers. So you can imagine this sight. You're a Union soldier trying to hold on to some ground. There are Union soldiers, white and black, further up trying to hold their ground. Mahone's attack takes place. You've got your own black and white comrades coming back on you with enraged Confederates behind them. And that's when you find a number of accounts where the white soldiers talk about, as they witness this retreat, this rout almost, out of desperation. Some of them do it out of anger. They write about this in their own accounts. A number of them are shot down. Northern newspaper accounts are a bit diverse. Depends on whether you're looking at a Democratic newspaper or a Republican newspaper. It's not a straight ahead distinction, but you get a wide range of reaction in terms of how the black soldiers are assessed. Some of them give them credit for the charge they make. Some of them ignore that and just talk about the retreat. So you have to sort of, it's a broad spectrum of responses from northern newspapers. But I should mention one other thing. This is not the first charge of black men at Petersburg. In the middle of June, during some of the initial Union attacks against Petersburg, there is a successful Union attack against Confederate earthworks that includes black soldiers, and they are successful. And they are praised in a number of newspapers throughout the North. And so this is a defeat. So they're looking for someone to blame. And obviously for the racial reasons, etc., the black soldiers are very easy to pinpoint the blame. Perhaps in the same way that the 11th Corps at Chancellorsville, made up mainly of Germans, is easily sort of blamed for what happens to the Union Army in May of '63. So good question, good question. One more here? Great questions, thank you.
Is this on? Yes.
Yeah.
Initially, at the Battle of the Crater, the USCTs were supposed to be the initial attack force. Can you discuss the decision to change that and who actually made it?
Okay.
And how much did that contribute to the debacle that took place?
That's sort of one of the great what-if questions of the summer of 1864 and the Battle of the Crater. You also might know that you'll sometimes hear stories about these there are 2 brigades in Ferrero's division, and you'll sometimes hear that these men are engaged in specific training for what's supposed to happen once this explosion goes off, what their maneuvers should look like. And what I found in my research was there are some regiments that were training for this. Other regiments you find no evidence of training for this attack. One thing to keep in mind is the 4th Division was being assigned different tasks that actually had it away from the 9th Corps for the weeks leading up to the attack. So they're doing odd things on various assignments leading up to the battle. They are positioned as the lead division when Burnside first formulates this plan, and it's really a last-minute change on the part of George Gordon Meade. As the story goes, Meade is worried that if this is another disaster of an assault, if these men are massacred, then it will look like the Union Army is sort of just throwing these men out to be butchered by Confederates. And so for political reasons, perhaps, it's not clear to me where Meade stands on his view of black soldiers and their service in the Army. I think that's another, I don't know enough about that, wasn't able to find enough about that. I think it's clear that he has some doubts about using them as the lead division. One of the reasons why Burnside chooses Ferrero's men is because, remember, much of the rest of the Army of the Potomac has been fighting through Virginia, the Overland Campaign. In the 9th Corps, those other 3 divisions are played out. They're tired. And Burnside actually does believe that with Ferrero's division, he has the best chance of breaking through after the initial explosion and moving on to Blandford, the Heights, and into Petersburg. If all goes well, if all goes as planned, just imagine the sight of black men actually the first to enter Petersburg. It would have been quite impressive, but it does not happen. It also sort of leads us to, again, many of these what-if questions. And I think now, especially at a time, the sesquicentennial, the story of the black soldier, the black Union narrative, soldier narrative is very popular. We like to talk about it, and I think it sometimes leads us to, well, they were so close to maybe getting this victory, right? It was racism. It was those pesky generals who just sort of, made the last-minute decision and ruined it for these men. Who knows what would have happened? It's hard to tell. I think we're out of time. Yeah. Thank you very much. That was great. Appreciate it.